When we came Aliyah, we left in the States a very important thing. You don't have to be Jewish to eat Levis.
Don't like rye bread.
Right. That was a placard
In all the subways. Buses.
On every single subway. Anytime you sat down in a subway car, there was this thing, you don't have to be Jewish to eat Levis. Okay? That was the thing. Okay. When Jabotinsky met Einstein, as part of the conversation, he told Einstein that to understand Judaism, Jewishness, Medina Yisrael, you're a miss. Because you don't know two languages from right to left. From right to left. Ivrit and Yiddish. And that's in the literature. Indeed, Einstein went for Spinoza. Einstein was a great physicist. Unbelievable. Even though some of his ideas were a forerunner in Poincaré and others. Nevertheless, Einstein was the man. Einstein is the most popular name in the 20th century. You can go on the street, 9 out of 10, or even 9.5 out of 10 will know who he was, Einstein. That's the name. Okay. So that was important. Had he known something about Yahadut, he would never have gone for Spinoza. So indicative, he was a great physicist, but a lousy philosopher.
Shouldn't say anything.
Okay? A great physicist, but a lousy philosopher.
He gave up Judaism when he was 14 years old, after his bar mitzvah.
13, before his bar mitzvah, 12.
Before.
He ran away because of the marvelous lessons that he got for his bar mitzvah.
Okay.
Understand it.
So that's what Jabotinsky told him. But there's something even more profound than that. And that is, when you're on a bus, and you're sitting in back of two old ladies, and one of them says, "So tell me the ganze Megillah." Stop what you're doing and listen to the conversation, because you're sure to get some juicy material. Okay, tonight, with respect to the Megillah itself, I hope to give enough to indicate the ganze Megillah, the whole story. The Megillah has been, what it means, what it's all about, has been eclipsed by Perushim and tradition and all whatever. And what I hope to do is to open up a new understanding of Megillat Esther. That doesn't mean that I'm the first one to get it. In my view, whatever I got as Chidushim, I say if one's going to look carefully enough, they'll find it in Chazal. But that's not to argue. That's just the idea. But anyway, from the point of view of what's out there on Megillat Esther, this whole orientation that I present tonight is a big, big chidush. For me, it's a Torah Amiti chidush, a genuine Torah chidush, but that remains open for the public to decide for themselves. Okay, so the ganze Megillah in Yiddish. Now, the first point that I want to make is that the Megillah has 5 main people in it. It's Vashti, Achashverosh, Mordechai, Esther, and
Haman.
What I discovered was that these people represent ideas. The story is not about the people per se, nor about the people carrying ideas, saying things and doing things and so forth. The story is about the concepts or the idea packages that these people represent. So that's the first chiddush to get straight. It's about the ideas that these represent. Okay, so what do they represent? So Mordechai represents Chazal, Torah, Yisrael. Esther represents Hashgacha. The Gemara says, Meifo, where do these come from? And so Esther is Astir Hastir. And that's Hashgacha, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu works in a secret way, and this is the Hashgacha. So Esther represents Hashgacha. Haman represents Amalek. Now we have left Achashverosh and Vashti. Achashverosh represents universalized religion. What does that mean on regular Chad without detail? What that means is there's a God, one God, who localizes in different ways of life. And the empire was 3,400 miles in length, and the policy, generally speaking, in Paras Mada, in Persia, was to allow the communities to have their own ethnocentric religious orientation, as long as they pay taxes and were ready to give their lives for the crown if necessary. And Persia had apparently a great military operation. Somebody mentioned to me in passing, because I was working on the 75,000. What is that all about? Is that a big number, a small number? Well, somebody said that when Alexander or something, when they confronted Persia, there were they talked about a million and a half people, soldiers and people ready to fight. In other words, we're dealing with big numbers. I didn't investigate the history, but I take it that that's part of the story. But there was this emphasis on ethnocentrism, and there was what was called a king of kings, and this king of kings manifested himself in different ways of life. And indeed, from the point of view of Achashverosh, who was this king, representative on earth of this godly king, the Jewish people was one of these people. So, in principle, there's no difference between one way of life and another way of life. They all come under one God, so they have a universalist orientation, but each one has its own development. Now, of course, that's against Torah 100%. The way to put it is, for Torah, God, the creator of the universe, gave the Torah to Yisrael. If you have a view which says there's a God of the universe, but he didn't give the Torah to Yisrael, according to Judaism, that is not a God. There is no separation between the God of the universe, Borei HaOlam, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu has no Teinat Torah. Of course, because we had Greek philosophy in between the development of Chazal and everything and the scientific revolution, there was the view of God in physics. There was an unmoved mover. In order to account for motion and causality, in Aristotle there was an unmoved mover, which came down in the medieval period to be God, and that had nothing to do with Matan Torah. Okay? But because of the power, the intellectual power of Greek philosophy and the Hellenism that we went through and all the rest of the history, this came down that there is a separation. But in Judaism, there's no such thing. Even in operational definition terms, the two go together. The Borei HaOlam, that's not a giver of Torah, is by definition not the Borei HaOlam, and vice versa. The one who gave the Torah didn't create the world. That's sufficient indication that he had a misconception of God. Okay, so for now, let this universalism remain without further clarification. We'll get back to it a little later. So that's Achashverosh. He represents universalist religion, and there was some materials in the Persian material. Like I say, they had this God of God and so on and so on. Vashti, the fifth character, fifth person in the story. Vashti. Who is Vashti? Historically speaking, Achashverosh is identified with Xerxes, and Xerxes' wife was a mistress, not Vashti. Indeed, I read and found somebody who wrote in a Greek source that Vashti was Achashverosh's mother. The point being, there's no mention of Vashti in Persian history. Nothing. Vashti is without representation, without a reference material, and so is Haman. There's no talking about Haman in Persian history. But come back to Vashti. So what's going on here? What does she represent? She doesn't represent anything. Why? What is she doing in the story? The other chidush that I discovered was that Megillat Esther is a story, what we would call a historical novel. Namely, it's literary in form and structure, and it has in it some things that are historically true and some things that are not historically true. Because as a literary production, the author, in this case the joint author, which was Chazal, Baba Basra says Chazal wrote Megillat Esther. They used the word katvu, they wrote. It means that whatever was there in materials that came down from the actual time, a proto-Esther, whatever was there, Chazal had or didn't have, but they organized, I use the word organized rather than wrote because it's too narrow, they organized, not from scratch probably, they organized what's come down as the book of Esther. Okay. So, being a literary structure, a literary thing, Vashti has a literary function only. Whereas the other characters, now I can call them characters because they are characters in a novel, whereas the other four have substantive, conceptual meaning, and in addition have literary functions, because the unit here is literary. So all of the other people have literary characteristics. Now, why nobody got it, I don't know. The only people in our tradition who wrote on Megillat Esther who did not take a historical approach, that what's being spoken about in the text is history, Persian history, things that happened. Okay? The only people that, what do I want to say? Forgot.
That
Anyway.
didn't take a historical approach. People that did not take a historical
Yeah,
approach.
people that didn't take a historical approach were the Mukubalim. Some people, the Ramah and others, Alkabetz, who I'll talk about later, Alkabetz and that's L'chododi, they interpreted Megillat Esther Kabbalistically. But other than that, nobody apparently took the Megillat Esther as a story, as a what I'm calling a historical novel, which has literary primacy, incorporating things that are historical and things that are not historical. For example, a king in Persia had to marry only a person from 7 or 9 royal families. That was the rule in Persia. What's it got to do with the story? They didn't talk about Vashti coming from a royal family. In point of fact, Vashti is not in the text where she came from or anything like that, no lineage and everything. She was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So she came from royalty, but was in exile. I mean, he wasn't king anymore, so she was his granddaughter, and she had a status of queen, a status of Malka. By being the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, with no function. But she was also the queen, Achashverosh. And that sets up this understanding of Vashti as a strictly literary figure, sets up the whole understanding of the Megillah, without which you can't understand a thing. Namely, he had two queens. The king had a queen by being married to this woman, Vashti. And Vashti had royalty by being the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so the basic storyline begins with the king inviting Vashti a room, not naked physically, naked, stripped of her status as queen in exile to Nebuchadnezzar, to come to his party, to his mishteh, we can talk about that later, to come to his mishteh as his queen, not as her royalty from being the grandchild of Nebuchadnezzar. So the story begins, the first beginning point of the story is, remember we're not talking history, the first point of the story is the king had related to Vashti, who had two statuses of queen. Without the details, he banished her, and it doesn't say he killed her and all the rest, whatever. He banished her because he didn't want to recognize her status of queen. Okay. In the story, what's happening? The storyline basically is, he searched for another queen. He found another queen, Esther, who was so beautiful she didn't even have to take the beauty treatment that was provided by Hagar, which was a year process of perfuming and all kind, which included some meditative things and so forth. There was a whole preparation. She didn't have to accept that. Beautiful, natural beauty of a person. Okay, so the king, as you know, finally he chooses Esther, okay, and he marries Esther. Again, don't ask questions about how could he marry a goy, and these questions are totally irrelevant to the story. When Chazal bring down different types of drashot and insight, one has to examine the context and try to understand how they are taking the story such that it makes sense to ask, did she come naked, and so on and so on. Don't jump too quickly from these Chazal pieces to the story. Let's deal with the story in its own terms as best as we can and get the picture of what's going on. And indeed, what is that picture? He got a new queen. Lo and behold, he didn't know that this person had two statuses. She was queen by being married to him, and she was queen to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the form of Hashgacha, which is the feminine. In other words, we don't have goddesses in Judaism. We don't have feminine deity. But in the story dimension, she was the Malka of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the form of Hashgacha. She represented the concept of Hashgacha, and in the story development, she is the queen of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
Do you mean in the sense of Shechina, like Shechina being feminine, and
right,
Shechina being
right.
either, Hester or revealed or hidden?
Right, but we're not moving toward the theological or to give explanation. It's just saying here's the basic material. Okay. And so we see, how do we know this? Where do we get this from? Well, the text was written by Chazal, Baba Basra 15. The text was written by Chazal, which means it had in it all the methodologies of drash that Chazal used, like word order, like letters missing, to take two fundamentals. It was written by Chazal. So in the text, there are these methods. That's how I got to Megillat Esther in the first place. I was working on Drash in Chazal. And then I got wind of this idea of the Megillah that was written by Chazal. I said, well, they must have a lot of stuff that I could use. I had no interest in the Megillah per se. So I got into the Megillah by being interested in something. It said, well, it was written by Chazal, then it must have material from Chazal. Okay. Well, lo and behold, when you look at the text about Vashti, in some places it says Vashti Hamalka, and in other places it says Hamalka Vashti. Lo Mikra. It's not, like sometimes when you're writing something and you want to repeat to be logical, you get a rumbling in your stomach that says, doesn't sound good. It's too logical. But you want to keep the same phrase so that you shouldn't disturb the reader, give him something else. You put another phrase in, then the reader is caught between two phrases, doesn't know exactly what you're talking about. But sometimes the aesthetic, your stomach growls and says, oh, I got to change it. It doesn't sound right. No, it's not that. And it's not Girsa. It's not a problem of Girsa. I read at least 20 books, including books by women people on Megillat Esther from the Chachmas Yisrael literature. Most of them concede and understand that it is a story. But when it comes to methodology of Chazal, nobody dealt with methodology. When there's a letter missing or a word order, it was handled in an aesthetic way, but nobody took the story to be made. Well, they didn't buy the beginning in the first place. The Gemara says it was made by Chazal. They're talking about a book of Esther that came down from the time and so forth. So they missed all of this. But for what I discovered was, here's the exemplification. And indeed, in places it says Melech, HaMelech Achashverosh. In a very few places it says Achashverosh. And in some places it says HaMelech. So, Chazal said that wherever it says HaMelech, it's referring to HaMelech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because as you know, and we'll get to it right away, there's no name of Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei or Elokim in Megillat Esther. So, there must have been a machloket about incorporating Megillat Esther into the corpus. I haven't found it, and I haven't found it like in Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim there was a big machloket whether to incorporate it into Nach or not, because it was too erotic. It had mashalim and material that was too erotic, and the Torah wanted to play that down. But there doesn't seem to be anything like that in Esther. There doesn't seem to be a machloket about that. There's a different machloket, but not about this. That it was too. How can you have a malka of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? There should be a reaction to that. I haven't found it. Maybe somebody will find it, and that will be very helpful to give chizuk to this orientation. So to come back to the story, so the king has two queens. The reader knows that. Esther represents Hashgacha. I'm saying the Hashgacha is the wife of a kohen. That's the form that the wife takes. So of course, she didn't need beauty treatment. Why she need beauty treatment? A wife of a Kodesh Baruch Hu has maximal neshama, maximal inner features, maximal outer features. So this was Esther. So the reader knows when you take this beginning point that Esther represents Hashgacha as the wife of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's information that the reader got. But Achashverosh didn't know that. He thought he's getting a beautiful girl to marry as queen who had only one status of queenship, being married to him. And the problem with Vashti will never come up again.
And that's what many men who divorce think when they marry the second time.
Another story. That's another story. But in any event, that sets up the plot. Now because the story has to have at least, at minimum, even if it's representational, some kind of a plot, usually character development, which is very minimal, if any, in this story. Plot is all important. And so what's the plot? You could figure it out. The plot is, he thought he's got one queen. And when they relate, and they make mishta and this and that, whatever the story is, she's queen to him. But as the story unfolds, the different events point to that she has a queenship that's coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and at the end of the story, that's ruling him, not he ruling her. In the beginning, she's the shliach of Mordechai, the messenger of Mordechai, doing what he says to do. And in the middle, she's the co-partner of Mordechai. And towards the end of the story, she's the head of Mordechai. She's leading the show. And that comes in the famous thing, she asked the king for machar. She asked the king for another day in the text, to destroy and kill those Jew haters that were in Shushan. The ones in Shushan Abirah were killed on the 13th of Adar. The ones that was left over, Shushan Abirah, and the ones in the outskirts, the 75,000, were killed on the 13th. They rested, and we celebrate, or those who were involved, celebrated on the 14th. But the killing took place on the 13th, and they celebrated on the 14th. Esther asked for another day to ostensibly kill the remaining Jews in Shushan, which is not the same as Shushan Abirah. There was the capital, and apparently there was it was surrounded by a wall. Archaeologically, there's some archaeological material, and I think there was a little like a moat. It was like a water stream of some kind that you had to go over. And so Shushan was the outskirts, like in Washington, D.C., and then you got the capital grounds. So Shushan Abirah is not the same as Shushan. You have to be careful of that in the text. And so there were these Jew haters left over in Shushan. So she asked for machar to get them killed by the Jews who are reacting now to have the king's letter and so on and so on. Okay. But in addition, in the same pasuk, in the same psukim that talk about why she wanted machar, she wanted machar in addition to hang Haman's sons. Apparently, Haman's sons were killed along with the 75,000 on the 13th. So she wanted another day to display them from the gallows by virtue, in order to degrade. So it wasn't a hanging to kill them, they were killed already, but it was a hanging to degrade what they stand for. At that time, at that point in the story, when Esther asks for machar, we have her beginning to become Esther as the head, as the leader of Yisrael, leading Mordechai and everybody else. Indeed, indeed, there were 3 times in the story, before she asked for machar, where the king offered her half the kingship. Well, why don't you take it? To have clout in Washington, big thing. We're living, that's what we do. I mean, the contemporary world with Judaism is saying, look, make friends with enemies, make friends with people, and get as much as you can. What's good for the Jews? Mordechai, he would have no compunction about doing that. But Esther refuses 3 times half the kingship. And the 4th time, I'm not going to do the analysis of the language, but it says ad, and then it says Od, and in the language, the very phraseology of the text, you see a difference in relation to this. If Chazal wanted to make it a coup d'etat story, it would fit 100% what's happening up to now. That Esther would organize the army and take over the kingship as the queen. But Chazal are not going in that direction. They want to show how Hashgacha is operating. So Hashgacha, in relation to the Mordechai Haman part of the story, it's clear from the text, the Hashgacha is the Hafachim. Everything that Haman wanted to do to the Jews was turned around for the benefit of the Jews. In the book, I make a table, and even in the book you got, I make a table which shows you, when you line up the language, it's just obvious. From chapter 3 and from chapter 8, you can just see the lineup. It's the same language, except it's lahefech. It's turned around. What was supposedly to be the killing of the Jews by Haman now becomes the killing of Haman followers by the Jews. And so the Haman Mordechai part of the story is built on Hashgacha with respect to Hafachim. But in the Torah system, there's a principle, especially in the Kabbalah, articulated well, that there's Hafachim and Lamala Hafachim. The root of this comes from the Chumash, when we have the Eitz Hadat, Tov V'Ra, and the Eitz HaChaim. Not Eitz HaChaim Amavet. Doesn't say that. It says Eitz HaChaim. In the Chumash, and it's not to be worked out now, but in the Chumash, Eitz Hadat, Tov V'Ra is Hafachim, like good and bad, true and false, beautiful, ugly, these are Hafachim. And Eitz HaChaim is Lamala Me Hafachim. We're not going to talk about that tonight, but that's just the root of this distinction. So Esther becomes the dominant person, the leader of Yisrael. And the Hashgacha includes two things. It includes Esther's contribution to the Mordechai Haman part of the story, which is going in terms of Hafachim. In addition to which, she's giving the Hashgacha, including the way in which Esther is L'mala Me Hafachim. We'll come back to that. Okay, so what we have now is, implicit in all of this, is two parts to the story. There's a Haman Mordechai part, and there's an Esther Achashverosh part. They are two distinct lines of development in the story. At a certain point in the beginning they come together, and then they diverge. How do they come together? The first point is, they come together in the fact that the people who celebrated on the 14th because of the killing on the 13th, it says in relation to them, Shlach manot ish l'reyehu. To commemorate that happening, that part of that fact, we send portions to our friends. What those portions are remains open at this point, but don't think too quickly about how Chazal structured the holiday. The point is, it says there, Shlach manot ish l'reyehu. And the ones who celebrated the killing of the people in Shushan, which was the reason ostensibly given why Esther asked for Machar, but included in there is her asking for Machar to degrade Haman's sons. Those people celebrate on the 15th. By those people, the text says, Shlach manot ish l'reyehu, u'matanot le'evyonim. It adds, the text adds to a phrase, matanot le'evyonim. What is that? What's the meaning of that? Alkabetz, who wrote in his Perush, which was the Kabbalah Perush, but every sefer is always worth something, even if you don't understand. I didn't understand a lot. It was real classical Kabbalah. I didn't understand a lot. However, when it came to this point, he says, Evyonim means rejected. It does not mean poor. In the Chumash, you can have a law about Evyon, a person that's poor, in poverty, and he requires tzedakah, and so on. But here, Alkabet says the term means rejected. Wow, what a blitz. Unbelievable, what a blitz. Rejected doesn't mean he was poor. We tend to reject the poor because they dress shabbily and so on and so on. But somebody can be well-to-do, but has a rotten personality. So we can't stand him. We reject. Somebody has different ideas. We reject out of hand. So that rejection, alienation, is the meaning of this matanot levyonim. The poor included. But matanot levyonim is not tzedakah. It's not giving tzedakah. Matanot, when I analyzed, not for now, but I analyzed matana, what does it mean to give a gift and so on, it turns out that the gift is coming from your recognition of the greatness, of the thankfulness to be alive. And so then you wish it on somebody else. In other words, it's you at the center, the person at the center, the giver is at the center, such that the receiver, in effect, is pulling from that dimension of the receiver. Like in Rab Nachman terms, you can't give zchut to somebody else unless you have it for yourself. Big piece in Rab Nachman on this topic, psychologically the case. If you don't have self-respect, you can't respect others. And the tendency of the human being in a religious framework is not to give himself credit for his bracha, for his mitzvot. It's to say what's wrong. He's preoccupied with averas and improving on avera, and not recognizing and taking in the greatness of having done the mitzvah. So that this, and it's not for now the full detail, but the analysis is that this is not tzedakah. This is this overflow of self-respect in oneself that carries over to others. It happens to be the case that in the Ramban's Perush on Kohelet, he ends the Perush with quoting from the Rambam Hilchot Tzedakah on this. For the Rambam, this was a category of tzedakah. The best tzedakah is, instead of giving the money, setting up situation where the guy can go to work and make the money. That's a higher level of tzedakah than giving the person the support. So that's in the Rambam, in the text, in a halachic context. But what we have here is this idea, and indeed, Alkabet says that that's the bottom line of the Jewish nation. Chaverim Kol Yisrael. That our bottom line in Hafachim is unification. No Jew calling another Jew a Nazi. No Jew degrading the other one. Yes, degrade the ideas. Argue it out in the public. But don't degrade the person. The person is always more than his ideas. You can't reduce the person to his ideas. So you can't reject out of hand. You can say, look, your opinion, I think it's wrong. I'm going to show you that. I'm going to work. I'm going to study it, and so on, so on, so on. So that's what we have here. We have this Alkabet's pshat on being rejected. What's the proof? The very next word in the text is v'kibel ha-Yehudim. What's the problem?
Singular.
Singular. Kibel is a singular. It says Yehudim. V'kibel Yehudim. Well, if we just got finished saying that what we need is more than shlach manot ish l'reyehu. Who do we give in Shlach Mano Ish L'Re'ehu? My Re'ah, if I'm a middle-class person, I give to a middle-class person, and the middle-class person gives to me. It's an exchange. But it's a unity. It's a unification. Because I'm giving out of caring, out of concern, and so forth. It's a unification. But it's not Kol Yisrael. Because those same people who give Shmach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu may not be fulfilling Matanot Levyonim. They're two different things. So in the people who celebrate on the 15th, part of which is celebration for Esther asking for Machar, which we'll come back to. So part of that whole orientation is Chaverim Kol Yisrael. And the darshaning in Chazal is on the last pasuk in chapter 10, when it says Rov Yisrael, that Mordechai was Mishnah Lamelech, and he had Rov Yisrael behind him, but not Kol. Not all. Our bottom line is all. Chaverim Kol Yisrael, not part. So we get a unification through Shlach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu in the Mordechai Haman part, but we needed the Esther contribution to finalize it. So Esther, by the text, by talking about Matanot Levyonim, has finalized or completed the Mordechai Haman part. But what's left over is the Machar. Where did that come in? We're talking now about the celebration was for the remaining Jew haters in Shushan. I'm saying, right in the same pasuk it says, and they hung the sons of Haman. So I'm just making sentences out of the text to indicate that, well, she asked for Machar to do that, to degrade, not to kill. Okay? So we're left with a problem as to understand Machar, what exactly is we talking about in the text, and in what sense does it go Lamala Mehafachim? Okay, so good. I've been assuming that the story is a historical novel, that the story has the characters in it who are representative of ideas. Where did I get the idea that Achashverosh represents universalized religion? Granted, Persia had this king of kings, and so, where do we get it, and where do we see it in the text? They don't say anything about that. Lo and behold, in chapter 10, the last chapter of Megillat Esther, we have a Kri Ktav. Namely, it says Achashverosh without the Vavs. That's how it's written. That's the Ktav. The Kri is, we read it Achashverosh, like usual. But in the text, if you look in the Megillah, you see the first pasuk, it talks about Achashverosh without the Vavs. Okay, look, remember, Chazal are writing the book. Throughout the Megillat Esther, there are about 3 or 4 places where it has one Vav. Over here, 2 Vavs are missing. Both Vavs are missing. And I explain why that is. Because in the context, there may have been something amiss. When you take out a letter, you don't have the full name or the full word. Usually there's something amiss. So it could be the Pasukim that have one Vav emphasize that Achashverosh had something that was not called quite good. And so it takes out 2 Vavs and puts in 1. And each one I explained in this terms about 4 or 5. It's not a big production. But this place has no Vavs. Meaning that when you read the word, but how are you going to read it? How are you going to read it? It has no Vavs. But Chazal say you read it Achashverosh like the rest of the text. Now in the Gemara, Chazal darshan, and they give a Agadah that they say, well, look at the letters. This really means Achashrosh, or Achashrash. He was a weak king. And they developed the idea, and especially in chapter 10, because he's putting taxes on the people, that for whatever the reason, with his wars and whatever the thing was, he was a weak king, he needed money. Or another dimension is he was weak in leadership, whatever the development. In the Gemara, these drashot, again, have to be viewed in context to understand what the text wants to get out. But they darshan that way. They're saying like the word, the way it's written says darshan me. I don't know. There's no vav, it doesn't, you don't get the pronunciation. Okay. So Chazal paved the way by their drashot, one of which has to do with the letters. They paved the way for somebody else to come and give a different understanding. Namely, Ach Shoresh. Ach Shoresh, that's what it says. Ach, no vav. Shoresh, no vav. So the letters, when you take the letters, you got 5 letters instead of 7. The vavs are missing. And so, following the example of Chazal, just the method, yours truly says, I'll give you a shot. It says, Ach Shoresh, brother of the root. What the hell is that? Brother of the root. What is that? What we call today sister religion is carried by the phrase Ach Shoresh. Who is the Shoresh? Yaakov, Yisrael. Who's the Ach? Esav, Edom. In the language of Chazal, Esav and Edom reflect Christianity. In Drashot Chazal and the material, Esav and Edom is a word used for Christianity. Wow! Now we're in a pickle. Megillat Esther is 586, I think, BC, Anshe Knesset Agdola. Way before Christianity. What's going on? Ach Shoresh, sister religion. So, Ach Shoresh means brother of the root, which I translate Yisrael, or Yaakov Yisrael was the root, and Esav, Edom, was the brother. And so the text in this piece, 3 psukim for chapter 10, the first one gives you this understanding with a big question. How does this relate to Christianity? Indeed, it's a universalized religion, that's for sure. And with a special relation to Judaism, which says that this religion will be the perfection of Judaism. So it's a special relationship to Yahadut, to Yisrael. But the basic point is that the brother of the root refers to Christianity. So one problem that we have to solve is, how did that happen? Well, the only explanation that's reasonable without the detail is that somehow at a later time, when Christianity was already on the scene, Beit HaMikdash, Sheni, whatever, there was Christianity, early Christianity emerging, and somehow Chazal wanted to include Christianity in the Megillat Esther. So, to have a Ktav Kri is not a redaction of the text. It's not they said, oh, well, we don't like what's written here, we're going to change it. They said, no, we'll keep you the same story, but we'll give you a Ktav Kri. It's a methodology in Chazal where you change the meaning. You have the letters one way and you change the meaning. So, I'm not going to discuss that tonight, but there's a whole problem here. How do we solve the problem of the dating of how does Christianity come into the picture? Okay, but the basic point is, at some time later than the rest of the text, it was put in by Chazal to relate the story, or to include in the story Christianity as an example par excellence of universalized religion. Persia was now past, and we're now in a different world, and so Christianity was the big point. In the law of Constantine, which is 4th century Christian era, there was a ruling that about the Jews not celebrating Purim because the Jews, grassroots, identified Haman or Yeshu with Haman. And so much so that the law, I think it was Constantine, whatever it was, the law had to say something about the Jews celebrating Purim. It's not the point that I'm making or anything like that, but apparently this was a big smack in the face to Christianity. To have Haman in this story, who represents Amalek, has nothing to do with Christianity, to have this in the text. So anyway, at a certain point in time, closer to Christianity, Chazal wanted to include it. They included it in by this drash. And indeed, when I saw that, that's how I got the idea that I started with. That Achashverosh represents universalist religion. There was history, but it didn't say anything about, it said about ethnocentrism for the king, allowing communities to develop in different parts of the empire and so on. But it had no explicit mention that Achashverosh represents or is indicative or some hint that Achashverosh represents universalized religion. I interpreted that from this piece in chapter 10, Achashverosh, Krav Kri. And so that got me onto the point, and then from that, I generalized and said, well, if Achashverosh represents something, then the others must represent, and then I started to follow the leads, and what emerged was this picture that I started with in the beginning, where the people are represented. So that if you ask the question, where is universalized religion in the text? It comes as a logical implication from the Kri Tav of Achshorish. So it's not coming from outside, it's coming from inside. Even though in methodology and discovery, I discovered it from the outside. But the goal is to get the text to talk in its own terms. So the big point is carried by the first word in the text in chapter 10. Indeed, chapter 10 is 3 psukim. What's it got to do with the text? It's a mundane answer to the end of the story. Esther, right? I'm not going to read it for you, but Esther said when she finished chapter 9, in chapter 9, so Esther, the last pasuk, chapter 9, pasuk 32. Umar Esther Kiyum Divrei Hapurim Ha'eleh V'Niftav B'Sefer. When we explain right away what this pasuk is talking about, what a beautiful way to end the story. On a very big high, because I'll explain right away why it's such a big high. This last pasuk, indeed, and the first one, 31 and 32. So, this has dignity. What does this have to do with chapter 10? It looks like, and there's a machloket, it looks like it was added in the first place. The whole thing was added. Not just the Krav Kri. We're leaving the scholarship aside, but the basic point is that short as this thing is, it's part of Megillat Esther, and it does carry, if nothing else, it's talking about the taxes and Mordechai becoming Mishneh Lamelech and having half the people rove, not all, which are important points substantively in the story. I agree, and I mentioned them in passing. But the basic contribution of these three psukim is the Ktav Kri on Achashverosh. And I talk about some speculations as to where it came in and so forth and so on, which is irrelevant for us. So the question now becomes remaining, a carryover from Machar. How does that get communicated, commemorated? And the last two psukim. If you look at the text, Umama Esther Kiyum Divrei HaPurim. Purim. What's the problem? Look at the text. It's Pei with 3 dots underneath, and Purim, the Vav is missing. Purim, when it's spelled completely, is Pei, Vav, Purim, right? Purim. Here, in this sentence, the last one, and in 31, twice. The Kaim et Yemei HaPurim, with the same spelling, the Vav missing. Again, Zelo B'Mikra. That's part of Chazal methodology. You got to keep it in mind. It's not Girsa. It has a meaning. Every single one has a meaning. I think I must have covered at least 50 in the Perush, and it leaves for others to do more that I may have missed. But the point is, every single place where the word order shifts requires a word, a comment by the reader to understand what is going on. This is a methodology by Chazal. What does that have to do? Purim without the Vav is Parim, cows. Parim is cows. The remez over here is the korbanot. In the last two psukim of the text, Chazal put in a spelling methodology which any reader knows is a remez to cows, which is in the korban system. So we talk about in Hanukkah, we talk about the Shivim nations, we have cows that are sacrificed and so on and so on. Animal sacrifice is the remez that's given in these two. Okay. When you examine more carefully, and I try to do that in a lot of the things that I'm working on, when you examine what is that all about, what is that korban thing all about, to me it has to do with life energy, states, and transformations, and I developed it in different places, in different parts of the book. So Esther is referring to Bayit Shlishi. Esther is referring to the korban system, which is a life energy system on my understanding, and indeed, that's the secret. Everybody will say, well, wait a minute. You've been criticizing Achashverosh as a universalist religion. What about Yahadut? Judaism is not a universalist religion. Sure is. No worse, maybe better, but certainly no worse than other universalist religions. I'm reading this Bhagavad Gita, Indian Vedic philosophy. Interesting. Good. That's also universalist religion. Morality, spirituality dominate the whole text. These were examples in India. These are examples of the religion, universalist religion. So I'm critiquing Achashverosh, but Judaism has been taken for a universalist religion and has been viewed by Jews, by Israel, exactly that way, as a religion, as a universalist religion. When one understands the system, the mitzvot system, and especially its root in korbanot, when one understands that implicitly, scientifically, namely, to understand how the korban is functioning in energy transformations, that's a scientific topic. I call it in liphonic physics, not important now. The point is, that's a universalism. But it's of a totally different kind. It's the universality built into understanding of the Bria. When we understand the life energy system of the human being, we will have an upgrade in medicine and all kinds of things that are related because of this universality. So the big point in these psukim is not just the remez to parim, cows, sacrifice, but when it's understood properly, that's the refutation. Judaism is not a religion. Judaism is not a universalist religion. Universalism comes because in the last analysis, it's dealing with a scientific, implicit scientific understanding. That's what we did in the Hanukkah book. That's what comes through in the Purim book. So when you understand properly what the Ramazim are here in Purim with the letter missing, you have right here the refutation of Achashverosh. So just as Torah says, the Chazal say, that the world is not complete as long as there's Amalek, Jew haters, for whatever the reason, so the world is not complete as long as there exists universalist religion. Where are we today? Where are we today? We are in the midst of a clash of civilizations. Use Huntington's phrase, just passed away this year. We're in a framework of clash of civilizations where religion, universalist religion, is a fundamental ingredient in the civilizations that are clashing. So the Megillah is saying that so long as, and Chazal talk about Achashverosh being worse than Haman, and indeed, universalist religion can sugarcoat and cover up what's really operative, and Haman doesn't cover it up. When you cover it up, you're worse. You can have this anti-Semitism, but it's worse. But the point being that in this last pasuk, we have the refutation of the idea that Judaism is a universalist religion. It has a universal dimension, but it's in the domain of the scientific. And as long as Achashverosh exists in the world is incomplete. Yeah.
What is a non-universalist religion? Are there any today? I mean,
that's a good question.
Like, what would that look like?
And in the last analysis, there are none. There's a belief in a God who created the world and then justifies a particular way of life. And the way of life is no better or no worse than another way of life. In the Jewish or Torah orientation, we don't look at HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we look at the system. And we say, let's get some criteria to measure the system. Is it pro-life, anti-life? When Chazal say in the Gemara, Yisrael is the pro-life principle, Amalek is the opposite. So we start to look at the content. But in principle, what do we have? We have a package of beliefs about a God, and that God justifies the way of life of the different peoples. Okay, so what we have here is a beautiful thing that in a good story, the suspense operates throughout the story, and I pointed out in different places because we're not sure that the king will come through, and maybe he won't like this, and Esther had to wait before she entered, and there's a whole lot of material in the story. Once you take the premise of the literary approach, your mind goes crazy because you can ask literary questions. When it's history, you can't ask a question, why is her name Hadassah? You can't ask a question, why is it 75,000 that were killed? You can't ask a question about different things unless you're doing psychoanalysis. What are you talking? That's a name. That's the name of the person. What do you want? That's an uvda. That's a fact. And if you're dealing with facts, that answers the question. What's her name? What's her lineage? But when you deal with a story, you can ask on all kinds of things, literary questions. That's why I'm finishing up the Peirush on the big one. You got 350 pages on the Megillat Esther, and there's at least 1,000 chidushim, because I could ask literary questions that nobody asked, because they didn't assume that it was a story. They assumed that it was history. What happened at the time? Whether there was a skirmish, whether there was some Jew hatred or not. That you need Persian history, and we need to be very sparse on what was the actual situation of the time. But for the point that I'm talking about, it's all irrelevant. The story is, as I said before, a historical novel. And indeed, wow! So, at the end, you had to wait to the end, as in a good story. You had to wait to the end, to the last two psukim of chapter 9, to get the point, the big sod of Torah. The big point, like Rav Chaim used to say in his language, man makes religions, God makes Torah. Sure, you could say, well, that was his way of saying, look, insiders and outsiders, you know. But the way I understood it is, he didn't say everything. And between the line, what he's talking about is just like God made the Bria, and our job is to understand it. So it's the same way with Torah. We're not oriented from the top, we're oriented from the bottom. And there's a lot to indicate that whole business. A few things left over. We accounted for the machar. We accounted for the surprise ending. Now even, why did Chazal opt to write it in a story form? Well, I think that's a blitz. Because the closest we can come to Hashgacha is an author who writes a story, who knows the beginning from the end and the end from the beginning. The author who wrote, namely the joint author Chazal, who wrote the text, knew in the page 1, when they wrote Achashverosh has 127 provinces, they knew what they're going to write. Not that they knew in fact, because sometimes in creativity, it's not always the case that the creative person has to have in mind the total symphony or the total poem or the total story. The mind works in a way, I know for myself. Sometimes you don't have the answer, you don't have the point. You sit down, all of a sudden, you find yourself writing the conclusion. You didn't think about the conclusion and then write it. You sat down in the machine and all of a sudden, something came out. Because the mind works in this subtle way. So what did Chazal do? They said, in effect, we're going to write it in a story form. Because the closest the human being can come is the story. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows the beginning from the end and the end from the beginning in this classical conception of Hashgacha. And we only know the beginning. We work in a time scale, so we don't know the ending. But Hashgacha has the beginning and the end. For the Pasuk in Yeshayahu, Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron, and so forth. So another beauty dimension of the whole Megillah story is that the form, the very form of the story, is as a historical novel, as a literary thing, itself carries or relates to or integrates with the whole concept of Hashgacha, which is the fundamental topic of the story. Why isn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu mentioned in the story? Well, my answer is literary. If the story is about somebody with 2 queenships, because she's the Malka of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to put HaKadosh Baruch Hu talk in the story will mess up the mess up the suspense, mess up the material, give the reader something that says Hashem is doing this, Hashem is doing that, Hashem is doing this, when the story is talking about the hashgacha, how events are being patterned into a hashgacha. The story is talking about concreta, about things that we recognize. When you put Hashem in the story, then you're messing up the literary. So it's not conceptual, it's not substantive. I made the point that on my understanding of why there's no Hashem and no Elohim in the story is because it would disturb the literary dimension. And indeed, Bimkom Zeh, Chazal said, ha ha, Hashem on every page. As the author, right? As the Chazal being the author and Hashem being the author of the Hashgacha. So when it says Hamelech and Hamelech HaChashverosh and you darshan them, you see that Hashem is on every page. And in the Perush, the big Perush, I darshaned all of them. In this generation, you know, if you don't spoon feed it, the reader won't get it. The Vilna Gaon said, for example, that whenever it says Elokechem in Dvarim, Dvarim is a speech, it's in second person. It says Elokecha 150 times in Dvarim because it's your God, whatever. It's a speech. So the Vilna Gaon said, wherever it says Elokecha, it's referring to the tzibur, to the cloud. Whenever it says Elokechem in about 10 places in Moshe's speech, it's referring to Kol Yachid v'Yachid b'tzibur. Well, the Gaon said it in 3 words, on the assumption that anybody who's interested in the Chumash will study that text or read it, or when he goes to shul, because this is so obvious. Once you see it, when somebody tells you this, I'm sure you'll never read the Dvarim the same, because it'll jump at you every time it uses the word Elokecha or Elokechem, the exceptions. You'll see that they're taught, if Hashem is supposed to help each soldier, it'll say Elokechem. If Hashem is concerned with Klal Yisrael winning the battles, it'll say Elokecha. I mean, so the Gaon could say it in 3 words and assume that the interest is so high that everybody will go home and not sleep that night and go and check the text. Well, Halavai, we should live in the Tkufa of the Gaon where we do. We're so indifferent and so calloused and so immersed in our own or traditional top-downism of interpretation, view, we're not even giving recognition to ideas that are alien, that are included under the discussion of the Alphabet's point of rejection. We tend to reject people with new ideas, people thinking out of the box. Let's argue the issues out, but love the person. In other words, let's not reduce the person to his ideas. Okay, so here we have the form of the story matching the very concept of the whole business. I think that more or less covers. I have some reading, but I'm not going to take the time to read. But all these points are written up, and the one that I will end on is the point that I just made. I said it at the end here. This 8-word pasuk, 932, is a penetratingly beautiful closing from Megillat Esther. It's the last mention of Esther that in effect carries Judaism's response to the universal religious theology of Achashverosh. As in good fiction, the reader has had to wait until the very end of the story to get the full understanding of what has transpired in the historical novel that is Megillat Esther. And with a surprise, like in a mystery story. And with a surprise ending as well. Who would expect that Purim ends where Hanukkah begins? But is it not worth the wait? And what we have here is a very sketchy, because there's so much that can be added and filled in. But what we have here is the ganze Megillah.